Anyway, what I want to discuss with you today is in part, the condition of this world. And I don't think I have to tell anybody that this world is really messed up. And it didn't just start. I mean, it's been really bad. Maybe it's gotten better sometimes and gotten worse. But yeah, I don't personally know of anybody that I would have to convince that this world is in pretty bad shape. Now, I've got a book at home. It was written by David Kapelian. The name of it is The Snapping of the American Mind. Has anybody read that book or familiar with it? It's a really fascinating book. And David Kapelian, the author, is from, I'm trying to remember the name of the country. I should know it. Anyway, his family history, his grandfather was his family back in Armenia. That's where it was, I think. They were Christians, and their family was persecuted because they were Christians. Then his grandfather and some more of his family was murdered because of that. And so when his dad was, I think, around 6 or 7 years old, his mother and him were able to migrate to the United States. So they did. Then his dad he was high up in the space program, I think it was. He became an engineer, was real highly respected. And David Kapelian, the author, has seen both sides of the situation, from the persecution back in, knowing the persecution from his family's side back in Armenia. And he recognizes what's going on in our society today. And he calls it the 100-year plan to snap the American mind and to change our culture. And, if you look back, it's pretty clear to see. And I was reading in the book about a couple years ago probably, and I recognize it because I have observed most of that in my lifetime, where it's, there's different things like changing of the meaning of words. The words that we used to use back 50 years ago, if you use that word today, it carries a different connotation oftentimes. Like, what's the song that Merle Haggard had? I think it was Merle Haggard about Okie from Muskogee. Was that it? Where it says where Coke used to be something you drink and that kind of thing. Well, it's kind of that kind of deal. But anyway, it was a pretty interesting book, and I would highly recommend it if you might want to read it. I was reading it one night, and anytime I read in a book, if I'm going to invest the time, I usually keep a blue ink pen and a red ink pen and a couple different colors of markers and mark what's important. And I'd read and I'd look back, it's pretty much all marked because there's a lot of good stuff in there. And I was reading it one night, and I told my wife, I said, I just put the book down. I said, I can't read this anymore. It's too painful. And so then a little bit later, I picked the book up and skipped to the back of the book because he had mentioned something about, there is hope. So I turned back to the back of the book and read some of the hope. That gave me the courage to go back and read more where I left off. But that's about the 100-year agenda that has been extant in this country for the last about 100 years or so. And it's actually going back to the Garden of Eden, because Satan is the perpetrator behind it all, and nothing has changed. We've got the same issues today that they had 6,000 years ago, because Satan wants to kill off mankind. If you think back 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, or 60 or 70, however far you can think back, things have changed a lot. And gradually over time, we don't tend to recognize it. We see this change and we think, man, that's horrible. We see this one, but sometimes we need to turn the dial back to however long we can and ask ourselves, how far off track have we gotten? And then we realize that we weren't really on track way back then. We were pretty far from it, but not as far as we are today. But God has called you and I to pioneer the way. So we don't want to be like that. We don't want to go along with whatever is in vogue with society today, whatever they want to peddle or promote. It's our job to follow God and to pioneer the way of peace. Let's turn to Ezekiel chapter 9, verse 4. That's Ezekiel chapter 9, verse 4. What time are services normally over at 4 here? I've got a new best friend here. I figured out how to use the stopwatch on my clock, but I forgot to start it. So I'll look at that clock back on the wall. Ezekiel chapter 9, verse 4. And the Lord said to him, Go through the midst of the city, through the midst of Jerusalem, and put a mark on the foreheads of the men who sigh and cry over all the abominations that are done within it. This book of mine, this Bible, has 1,095 pages in it. So what's it all about? You know, sometimes it can seem overwhelming. It's got history, genealogies, sacrifices, prophecies. What's the bottom line? When you distill it all down, what is God looking for? The title of this message is Do Justly, Love Mercy, and Walk Humbly Before Your God. Let's turn to Micah chapter 6, and we will start in verse 8. And this is just a little background. This is a message that God sent through Micah that had 3 parts. The first part is to expose Israel's sins. The second part was Micah was to give them the message that pictures the punishment that God was about to send to them. And then the third part, the last third of it, was giving hope and restoration after their punishment was administered. And it's just like a loving father that says, okay, son, you messed this up. I told you don't do this, and you did it. Now I'm going to have to punish you. I'm going to have to spank you. And then he gives his son a big hug and says, it can be okay if you obey me. So starting in Micah chapter 6, verse 8. Micah chapter 6, verse 6. This question is posed. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before the high God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, 10,000s of rivers of oil? That's a lot of oil. Shall I give my firstborn for my transgressions, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? Those are some pretty serious things. In verse 8, he says, He has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly before your God? And I can pretty much just go sit down right there, and that's pretty much it in a nutshell. But I'm gonna expand on it a little bit. And let's read this same verse, Micah chapter 6, verse 8, in the Amplified. I like to do that a lot of times because it does just that. It amplifies the meaning and makes it more clear. He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you except to be just and to love and diligently practice kindness and compassion and to walk humbly with your God, setting aside any overblown sense of importance or self-righteousness. I've come to learn, maybe the hard way, that truth is truth no matter where you hear it. If I say something that's wrong, it's wrong regardless. A good friend of mine made a comment to me several years ago. He said Herbert Armstrong was right 100% of the time when he was right, and he was wrong 100% of the time when he was wrong. And that's true with any of us. That God's not a respecter of persons. He doesn't take if it's somebody he favors, which he doesn't say, okay, if this person says it, then I'll change everything and I'll make that right. No, it's not the way it works. Right is right and wrong is wrong. So let's analyze these three different issues. Okay, in point number one, do justly. Doing justly would have been understood by Micah's audience as living with a sense of right and wrong. That's pretty simple. We understand that. The problem was the judicial courts, they were respecters of persons, and they liked to use their office for personal gain and to benefit those that they would like to benefit. And that's called corruption. We have the same problem today. You know, you look at the government back then, or you can look at it today. We have the same problems. We have the same author behind it, who is Satan. Doing justly is simply doing what is just, doing what is right or what is godly. And the framework for doing what is right, doing what is just, is the Ten Commandments, broken down into the two great commandments: love God and love our neighbor. Let's turn to Matthew chapter 23, verse 23. This ties in with the subject. Matthew 23, 23. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe of the mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law of justice, mercy, and faith. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. Let's turn to Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. Well, no, you can turn there if you like. I'm going to read this out of the Amplified. It says, Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, why do you make me see iniquity and cause me to look on wickedness? For destruction and violence are before me. Strife continues and contention arises. Therefore, the law is ineffective and ignored, and justice is never upheld. It's our job to uphold justice. If we see a situation going on and it's within our power to have influence on that and correct that, I mean, help steer that situation in the right direction, then we should do that. We should never be afraid to do the right thing. God's in charge of the outcome. If we just do the right thing, this guy right here behind this button, if I just do the right thing, God's in charge of the outcome. He can handle that. The problem is us doing the right thing. That's the big challenge. Continuing on here, for the wicked surround the righteous, therefore justice becomes perverted. And let's turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 16, verses 18 and 19. Deuteronomy chapter 16, verses 18 and 19. This is God's instruction. You shall appoint judges and officers in all your gates, which the Lord your God gives you, according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people with just judgment. You shall not pervert justice, you shall not show partiality, nor take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and twists the words of righteous. Just like the scale of justice that we have here in the United States, she's blindfolded. She's got, the scales, and she's blindfolded. She's not looking to see who it is to determine how to judge it. I'll refer to Psalms chapter 145, verse 17. The Lord is righteous in all his ways, gracious in all his works. So what does doing justly look like? It's treating people fair. If we're doing business with somebody, let's say we've got a mechanic and he gave us a price, in his best estimate what something will cost, and maybe he got into it and into the job and he discovered, it's going to take a lot longer than he thought it was going to take in order to do a good job. On the other hand, they could just throw it together and, for the price that was stated. But there's occasions that we run across where we were quoted a price, and then we know this guy and we know he's honest and he's doing a good job. He wants to give me back a good product. Sometimes, if we're able to, and which kind of gets back to never be afraid to do the right thing, Sometimes we need to give that person more money because we know he earned it and we don't want him to get burnt. He's got to put gas in his tank and beans on the table every day just like the rest of us do. So we need to always make sure we're not looking out not only for ourselves, but just like it says in Philippians, but we're looking out for the other person too. Just like the golden rule, isn't there a book titled Everything You Need to Know You Learned in Kindergarten? Something like that. It's all pretty basic stuff. Sometimes we make it more complicated than what it really is. The second point is love mercy. To love mercy means loyal love or loving kindness. We all like to be treated with loyal love. We all like to be treated with kindness. Along with justice, Israel was to provide mercy, and we're to do the same thing today. Both justice and mercy are foundational to God's character. Let's turn to Psalms chapter 89, verse 14. Psalms 89, verse 14. Verse 14 says, "Righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne. Mercy and truth go before your face." So it sounds like mercy is pretty important if that's foundational to God's throne, and thank God it is. What if God didn't have righteousness and justice? I'll refer back to Matthew 23:23. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith." So again, the golden rule comes into play here. Pretty simple. Treat other people the way you would want to be treated. In Psalms chapter 145, verses 8 and 9, it says, "The Lord is gracious and full of compassion, slow to anger, and great in mercy. The Lord is good to all. His tender mercies are over all his works." Now let's turn to Matthew chapter 5, verse 7. Matthew chapter 5, verse 7. And it simply says, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy." That's a pretty short verse, but it's a pretty huge concept. If we want mercy, we need to be merciful to others. I'll give you an example of mercy that I hugely appreciated. It's been about, I think 33 years ago or so, we were building an apartment complex in Denison, Texas, and we were always really busy, and I had gone into town to get, to the lumber yard or something to get something. Came back, my right foot was a little overactive because I was speeding a little bit. And so I got pulled over, got a speeding ticket, and got a date to appear in court. And that day came, and like I said, we were really busy, had a lot of people working on the job. And so I called into the police station to ask, or the court, to ask if they could postpone my date. And the kind lady said, sure. So I think she set the date off for 2 more weeks in the future to appear by then. So, okay, that was good. And then my brother Gary, my next older brother, he had come up from Gladewater. I was about a couple of weeks later, I guess, to work up there for us. He had just gotten there in the evening. We kept an apartment out of town wherever we were working, so we were living in an apartment in Sherman. I got Gary an apartment there too. And we were sitting there eating, and somebody knocked on the door. I went to the door, it was a police officer, and he was there to arrest me for failure to appear. And I told him what happened. I told him I called in, and the lady said, be fine. She set the date, postponed it. And he had to have, seems like it was $120 or something like that, cash, or he was going to have to take me to jail. because I didn't appear, but I had already handled that, supposedly, but apparently the lady at the court system didn't make a note of that. So I got all the money out of my wallet that I had. Linda got all the money she had. My brother Gary that just got up there got hosed, and he gave me all the money he had, but it wasn't enough. Okay, so here comes the mercy. The police officer told me I could write him a check, and he gave me his money to pay. I really appreciated his mercy. And by the way, my check to him cleared too. But we all need mercy from time to time, and we should give mercy. Okay, the third point is walk humbly with your God. Walking humbly with God is a description of our heart's attitude. God's people depend on Him, and rather than on our own abilities. You know, it's easy to get focused on something, and I do this from time to time. It's like, I got to make this happen, and so I get my head in making it happen, and then sometimes, if I'm not careful, I leave God out of the equation. I should keep my head in walking humbly before God, and He'll always work out the details if I get this guy right. Instead of taking pride in what we think we might bring to God, because we don't bring anything to God, we need to humbly recognize that no amount of personal sacrifice can replace a heart committed to justice and love and to God. We're all to become Christ-like and look at His example of humility. Let's turn to Philippians chapter 2, and we'll read verses 7 through 9. Philippians chapter 2, verses 7 through 9. I love this chapter. The whole chapter is just really rich. I usually refer to the 6 verses before this. Speaking of Christ, but made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant and coming in the likeness of men. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient, not just obedient, but obedient to the point of death, even the death on the cross. Therefore, God also has highly exalted him and given him the name which is above every name. That's the way we should walk humbly before our God. I ran across a quote from John Wooden. Says, "Talent is God-given, be humble. Fame is man-given, be grateful. Conceit is self-given, be careful." There's a lot to that. Pride comes before a fall. In James chapter 4, verse 10, I'll just read it here. "Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and He will lift you up," just like He did Jesus Christ. On a personal note, I can never read this scripture without thinking of my father-in-law. And I wish I'd thought to bring it, but I have this piece of wood that he died, I think it's been 10 years ago. He was a really hard worker, really honest man, and he had a heart to follow God. And before he died of colon cancer. Linda's stepmother, asked me if there's anything I would like to have. And I told her, if you don't want it, I'd love to have that piece of wood. And that piece of wood, it looks like is probably a piece of firewood that he split. We've got a picture hanging in our hallway at home of E.M., that was his initials, E.M. for Enoch Madison Clayton. He's got a picture of him. He's got this whole long row of firewood split, all split by hand. He just finished, I guess it was a tree laying there that he'd cut up, and he split this whole log by hand. And I assume that piece of wood was a piece of firewood, but it looks like it's got stain on it, but it's not. It looks like it has stain, like a cherry-colored stain and polyurethane finish or some kind of oil finish. But I'm sure that what appears to be staying and finished is the oil from his hand. And what he used that piece of wood for is kind of like a piece of fire would be, thicker on one side than the other. Every morning his routine was he would reach over to the bar, get that piece of wood, set it on the kitchen table, prop his Bible up on it like that, and he would read his Bible. And he didn't stop there. He wasn't just reading his Bible, he did what it said. And a lot of people read their Bible, but it goes in one ear and out the other. He read his Bible, and a lot of things in his life, he had a hard life, but he did what he thought God required of him. Let's turn to Isaiah chapter 66, verse 2. I read this at his funeral. Isaiah chapter 66, verse 2. For all those things my hand has made, and all those things exist, says the Lord. But on this one will I look, on him who is poor and of a contrite spirit, and who trembles at my word. I'll read that in the Amplified now. For all these things my hand has made, so all these things come into being by and for me, declares the Lord. But to this one I will look graciously, to him who is humble and contrite in spirit, and who reverently trembles at my word and honors my commands. Let's turn to Isaiah 61. Well, no, you don't need to turn there. You can turn to Luke chapter 4. We'll read verses 18 through 20, which is quoted from Isaiah 61. I love this scripture. Luke chapter 4, starting verse 18. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he is, this is what Christ read when he stood up in the temple. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted. You've got to love that. Think of all the brokenhearted people in the world. The world's full of brokenhearted people, and we should be there for them to help, to do justly and love mercy and walk humbly before our God. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives. I've never been captive, but I'm pretty sure if I had been, that would really mean a lot to me. It does anyway. The only time comes to mind when I was held captive was we had an old truck bed just sitting on some blocks on the ground, and it had a barrel laid down on its side in it, and it was covered up with corn. And I got in there one time, and one of my brothers shut the tailgate, and I was held captive for just a little while. But that's what I think of when being held captive. But think of all the people that are being held captive, whether imprisoned or whatever, unjustly. And there's a lot of that. Obviously everybody in prison is not there unjustly. But there are a lot of people in prison unjustly. So Christ is saying he's coming to proclaim liberty to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, set at liberty those who are oppressed. There's a lot of oppressed in the world. And getting back to these things we read earlier, what Israel was guilty of doing, of unfair judgment, the same thing that happens today. Verse 9, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. Here's an excerpt from, I stumbled across the Berean. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. I was looking something up online about the Bible back here 3 or 4 years ago, and this one site came up, and I read it, and I thought, well, that's pretty good. And I ended up subscribing to it online. I get an email every morning with this kind of like a daily devotional. And come to find out, it did a little research. Some of you probably are aware of this, but they used to be a part of the Worldwide Church of God back years ago. And from what I see, it looks like they've stuck with the truth. But Christ, just like I read in that article in the Berean, Christ thinks like the Father, he speaks like the Father, and he acts like the Father. That's our job. We're to do the same thing. We're to be a reflection of our Father and of Jesus Christ. I heard a sermon here maybe 3 years ago, and I don't quite remember the fellow's name. He was a surveyor. Maybe some of you were here, maybe you heard it, or maybe you'll remember who he is. But he was, I think, from Colorado or somewhere up there. He did surveying. He was telling this story. Do you remember his name, Bruce? Yeah, that's right. He gave this sermon. He was telling about, it was on the Sabbath day, and he was out in the woods in, I don't know, Montana or Colorado or somewhere. He was on a surveying job and took the Sabbath off, and he was sitting there in the woods reading his Bible. And there was this honeybee hive somewhere nearby. These bees were coming and going really fast, and, just busy as could be. And he made the point that the bees think they're saving the hive, but in reality, the bees are saving the world, because without the bees to pollinate the plants, things couldn't exist. And we're the same way. We're like those bees, because we might think, well, we're here to do whatever, pay our bills and all of that and raise our family. Well, that's true, but we also have a higher calling than that. Our calling is to save the world, because it's for the elect's sake that the world will be saved. Okay, so it's time for the test. Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't warn you. Okay, 3 things. We've got 3 questions on the test. What does God require of us? Number 1, to do justly. Number 2, love mercy. Whoops, that's number. It's hard to do number 3. Number 3, walk humbly before our God.